Over the next 3 minutes, I'm going to give a quick summary of how I built this simple retaining wall, and then I'll come back at the end and add some details. If you have a slope, it's best to start at the bottom of the slope and work uphill. Leave yourself a gap behind the wall that you'll fill in later with gravel and dirt. Sand, pea gravel, or paver base can be used to level the first row of the wall. I use a large drill bit with a 1/2 inch diameter that I pre-drill holes for rebar that's going to attach and secure these first rows to the ground. I set them with a tamper, check the level, and then drive the rebar into the ground to secure them. 1 foot or 1.5 foot steel rebar should be sufficient. I ran my first row of lumber into the slope until the top was level with the ground above it. I repeated the rebar process on the back half, and then on the front half, I used a 5-inch screw to attach the 2 pieces of lumber to each other. I continued to step my way up the slope, leveling the ground so it was flush with the top of each row as I went, and I like to drill pilot holes for those 5-inch screws, but you don't have to. I laid out the timbers so that each joint would be staggered compared to the joint above and below it. Once I got to the flat part of the wall, I switched to a pea gravel base because it drains better than sand. Since this is the only angle in my wall, I dry fit this first course to make sure that it was a perfect 90-degree square before I drove everything in. The timber on the left was a 10-footer so that it could bridge that entire span without any joints, but they are a lot more expensive. For the rest of the wall, I switched to 8-foot lengths with a few 10-footers in between for strength. This is a 4-foot dead back, teed off at the end and sunk into the dirt behind the wall, and this will provide strength and prevent the wall from leaning forward as the dirt settles over time and puts pressure on the wall. Once the wall was built, I covered the dirt behind the wall with landscape fabric before I backfilled it with gravel, and this prevents the dirt and the gravel from mixing and preserving the drainage. You can fill it all the way to the top with gravel. I chose just to fill it about 3/4 of the way high, and then I'll come back and cover the rest with topsoil so I can plant grass. But before adding the dirt, I folded the landscape fabric over top of the gravel so again the dirt doesn't leak into the gravel bed. Hope the speed round gave you a good overview of how I built this wall and kind of what you're getting into with this type of project. Now I'll try to go back and fill in some details of stuff I skipped over. For example, if you want a perfectly straight wall, you can lay your first row according to a string line. It's not critical, but it is nice if you're a perfectionist. So this is obviously something you would do before you start laying out your first row. Basically, once you have your string line, you just lay your first row to the line. The good news is you don't have to have a perfectly straight wall. In fact, a wall that has bends and joints in it is actually more stable than a perfectly straight wall. But that does mean that you won't have nice clean joints where your 2 pieces butt up against each other. You might have to miter some corners, find some angles. So it's really a matter of personal preference and aesthetic. Or you can just do what I did and eyeball it, and as you can see, it got pretty close. Another thing you can do is rather than setting each row exactly on top of each other and having a perfectly flush face, you can offset them back a little bit, and that will kind of help counteract the dirt wanting to push the wall this direction. And it also helps follow the slope of the wall, which is typically tapered back a little bit. And you would do that using a gauge like this. This is a pretty deep gauge. Typically you only want it to step back about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. But basically you would just use your gauge like this. And then you would keep doing that with each successive row, and that will allow you to step your wall back just a little bit and really help it kind of feel wider. When you get to a corner, you can attach each successive row with the same 5-inch screws you've been using for every other row. You just have to stagger them a little bit so you don't run them into each other. Or you can drill several rows at once and use 1/2-inch rebar. That's what I'm going to do. Similarly, when you're attaching the end of your dead back, you can do that with your 5-inch screw, which would basically, you can see how deep it's going to go into the one below it. And that's going to provide some stability, but it's a lot better if you drill it and put some of that 1/2-inch rebar, because then you're attaching above and below it. And this is only 1 foot. You can do even longer than this. You just have to drill as you go, because as far as I know, the drill bit, at least the one that I have, is only about 16 inches. So that's about the max I can drill at any one time. I should also clarify, most people call these dead men or dead legs. My grandpa's who taught me how to build retaining walls. He called them dead backs, so that's what I call them. I'm trying to adjust the courses and figure out where each course is going to end in order to match the slope of the yard coming down here. And I'm just doing that by basically taking a level off the yard, and I'm marking it right here, and that's where my course will end. Over here, I've obviously got this whole situation going on, which is preventing me from digging a trench, and I don't want to have to rip it out. So my compromise is basically I'm going to take a stake and ram it back in there, and that will get me at least part of the function of a dead back. You can see I've cased the opening right here to the exact dimensions of my 2x4, so it holds it square as I'm driving it in. Yeah, so this did not work as well as I hoped it would. You can see from this shot here that it's solid clay I was trying to drive this thing into, but it was better than nothing. Well, thanks to daylight savings time, I ended up building a lot of this in the dark, which is why I don't have great footage of the entire build. But once you get the basic steps down, it's pretty repetitive. Because I couldn't get dead backs into this entire section here, I ended up buttressing this side so that I would get just a little bit of a 90-degree angle. It's not going to be as good as dead backs, but it's still going to prevent this from leaning forward a little bit. A temptation might be to attach the wall to your house, and that's not a good idea for a couple of reasons. If it causes any damage to your foundation or to your wall, that's going to be a lot more expensive to repair than having to rebuild a fence. Definitely don't want to attach anything to the side of your house. I backfilled about 75% behind the wall with gravel on the bottom and then dirt on the top, and there's a lot of clay mixed into that dirt, so it's less permeable than topsoil. But then in the spring, I'll come back, finish it off with topsoil, and then plant grass seed. Another thing that I didn't do was I could have drilled weep holes in this bottom row here to allow any water that percolates down through the soil and the gravel to just kind of weep out from this bottom row as opposed to collecting behind it. I could still go back and do that at some point. It would have just been easier if I had done it before I laid this lumber. Another thing I could have done is to run a perforated pipe at the bottom underneath the backfill behind this wall, and that would have created a true French drain. I didn't do that because I've got about a 7 to 9% grade already kind of going downhill, so that's going to take the water in that direction naturally. Pressure treated lumber needs a couple months to dry out, but then it can be stained to preserve it long term. If you don't do that, it'll end up looking like this up here, basically discolored and gray. This is obviously much older. So in the spring, I'll come back and stain all of this and my pre-existing fence the same color, and it'll look a lot better. So let me know what you think of the speed round at the beginning. I figured there's a lot of these retaining wall videos out there, and I wanted to do something a little different. I also try to get as much content to you up front and save the talking till later. I'm going to have a parking pad video, which shows how I built all of this that I'm standing on and all the digging and gravel that I laid. Let me know if there's anything here you would do different, which you usually do, and I appreciate that. And I guess I'll see you on the next project. Thanks for building with me. As dirt pushes the wall forward, the wall starts to lean, and the dead back prevents it from doing that because it's basically a lever. You keep pressure on this end, and it prevents this end from leaning. Does that make sense? Can you still see her butt? Sit. Sit. Butt down. Sit. I hope you're getting all this. This is